Hey, Vinyl Community, Jeff back again, jumping on number 6 of the VC Lottery questions. And yeah, trying to plow through these real quick. Number 6, quick and simple again, all the details below. You can see the original video. You can see, what the question's about. Jump on board. You still got time. Into June is the deadline. And anyway, so this one's kind of a fun one. It's the, you're putting together like the massive concert. There's a lot of details, but basically just, you're looking at every decade and you're putting together this concert with the band represented from every decade and this massive, I mean, it'd be like a festival event, all-day festival event of some of the best bands from each decade. So, starting with the 60s, I mean, there's just, wow. If you think about it, can you imagine putting together a show from I guess if you go back too far, 30s, 40s, stuff like that, you have a lot of big band type stuff. But that would even be fun, I think. I think it'd be great to go back to the heydays, see some of the big band guys, Glenn Millers and the people like that from way back in the, way back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. That's when my parents grew up. I'm sure they probably saw some great stuff back then. But anyway, starting with the 60s, some of the most pivotal bands, and then putting together the best or, one of your favorites from that time. So I've got some things that they semi connect, at least the first couple. So I'm going with the Beatles. I mean, you don't get much bigger than that. You start with the 60s, you're going to get a band like the Beatles. They were probably one of the most influential bands over pretty much all music from that point on, especially in the rock category. So, over the years, I've read so many interviews and so many biographies and everything, and people always say, yeah, that time I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, that's when I knew I had to be a rock star. They were one of the most influential bands that led on to so many other bands in the 70s and 80s becoming musicians, all based on them. And of course, they still have staying power. People still listen to them. A lot of people in the VC here are big Beatles fans. I think that they would be the ultimate first band to see. It's just kind of like a timeline of amazing stuff. So Beatles would represent the 1960s. Now, one of the bands, this is because it's in my little camp, I read so much stuff by them in the 70s about how they saw the Beatles and wanted to be stars. I mean, it just seemed like this is where it all started for me, but they were highly influenced and they became stars in the early 70s because of that. And that's Kiss, one of the biggest bands in the 70s. I mean, one of the biggest bands in many ways, period. But in the 70s, they ruled. Now, they may not have ruled with the critics, but their heyday was, in the beginnings from the 72, 73 years on into the end of this, into the 80s. They were just at their highest points. And yes, so, they would just come out and blow the show away with their stage show and everything, because the 70s, to me, that's when I discovered them, and that's, the costumes were at the height, in my opinion. The stage show was at the height, in my opinion. It was just the ultimate experience. 1977-ish, can you imagine, the Kiss Alive 2 tour type thing, the stage show, the costumes, that's my sweet spot there. But yeah, so Kiss would be representative of the 70s. They would just come in, get the show churning a little bit further. And then you got bands in the late 70s who were starting to break. But you got Gene Simmons of Kiss, who, I don't want to say discovered them, but he kind of took this band, got them to do some demos and shared them with their label, trying to get this band a label because he was impressed with them. Kind of, decided to make some calls for them, put some feelers out there for this band, which led to super popularity. Van Halen eventually did get signed, and of course, late 70s, but by the time the early 80s hit, they were just a force to be reckoned with. I think I first saw them on tour around 81, around this time frame. So this is, fair warning-ish. This is about the time I got into them more, was around this time. So, yeah, so there you go. So then Van Halen became the ultimate party band all through the 80s. And yes, in my concert world, everybody would love everybody, and you'd have both Sammy and Dave out there doing all their songs because, it'd be a great recap of the entire 80s era of Van Halen. But yes, there you go. Van Halen would jump in for the 80s. Then as we move into the 90s, the band that was the most influential for me and probably the most staying power for me in the 90s was Dream Theater. I mentioned them, had this album from the previous video. But you know, they were early '90s. They popped in, and just all of their albums from the '90s and even into the 2000s, into the early 2000s, for me, were just the pivotal stuff for them. So they would definitely represent. They were breaking through, and you know, had hits and stuff in the '90s, including this masterpiece here. So they would represent the '90s for me. And then along the same lines of them, the whole prog rock world and prog metal and whatever you want to call it. In the early 2000s, you had a lot of bands like Dream Theater in the '90s, and then in the early 2000s, we saw a split up of a band. Singer left, and he became solo. And since then, Neal Morse has ruled my world since his first album in like 2003, I think. And to this day, still a strong force, just churning out top-notch music. And so for me, the 2000s and beyond would be highlighted best with Neal Morse putting on a 3-hour show of his greatest stuff. I mean, his albums tend to be over 2 hours long, and he does them in concert, you know, the whole night with type thing where he's got like, he plays the whole album in its entirety. And he's done that for many of his albums. This is a pretty long album, 2 record set, 2 CD set, etc. Neal Morse, just one of my loves, just prog rock. He's all harkens back to all just the harmonies of the Beatles, harmonies of, you know, Yes, and you got all of this stuff from the, you know, Gentle Giant days, just everything from the prog classic 70s, kind of brings it all back in. So you've got that throwback to the older sounds of the 60s and 70s. And you bring it all forward into the, add a little bit of Dream Theater in there, you know, add some of that rock and metal, and you got just an amazing, and this is Neal Morse solo, and then of course the Neal Morse band became a solidified thing a few years ago. So there you go. So yes, that would be for me an ultimate experience. You get the Beatles. I'd hate to say they're opening, but this is how the the lineup is. You get the Beatles, they come in and just wow the crowd. Kiss comes in and blows their faces off. Van Halen comes in and just ultimate party rock, and then you got Dream Theater coming in that's going to just touch your technical side with their amazing instrumentalities and powerful songs there. And then you got Neal Morse coming in and sealing the whole deal with just bringing it all together with amazing songs and amazing harmonies and amazing music. That's it for this one though, number 6. I'm jumping on number 7 soon. Thanks for watching. Rock on and rock hard.